Well, today we are continuing a worship series that is exploring that week leading up to the first Easter. The goal of our series is to look at each day of that week, exploring the events that took place from a theological, historical, and scriptural perspective. And as is always the case, as we explore the ancient story, we want to pull out from it not only meaning for that day and time and the audience to which it was aimed at then, but also we want to pull out the message that guides and shapes us in the modern context. If you are interested in diving in a little bit deeper into what we talk about, we've set aside and recommended 4 books that follow along each day of that week leading up to Easter from very different perspectives. You can find information about those books, including my own personal reviews, online. We've connected it everywhere you are seeing or hearing this sermon. You can find that information through links to be able to get to that, look at those books, pick 1 or 2 that you might like to read, and find out more information on where you can get it and purchase it. Well, today we're going to talk about the Tuesday of that week leading up to Easter. And it's interesting because that Tuesday is one of the most eventful days of that week. It's one of the days that Scripture spends the most time talking about, and it's a day that is critically important to the events and ministry of Jesus as he's moving toward the final events that are going to lead to Easter, to his crucifixion, to his death, burial, and resurrection. What I'm going to do today is I want to pull out 3 stories from that eventful day. And the reason that I want to focus on those 3 stories is because they get at the heart of something that was going on during that day. You see, as Jesus' popularity was growing, the religious leadership began to grow more and more uncomfortable with him and his presence. The more popular he became, the more threatened they began to feel. And so they began to talk about ways that they could entrap Jesus and make him look bad, either to the people of faith or to the Roman government. Now, this is something that takes place throughout the gospel story, but on Tuesday of that week leading up to Easter, those efforts to really entrap Jesus start to ramp up in a very powerful way. And so we're going to look at 3 of those stories, 3 of those examples, and talk about how Jesus responded to them and what they say to us as we look back on them and try to learn from them for our lives today. So one of the early examples of entrapment, the first example of entrapment on that day, comes from primarily the Pharisees. Now again, the Pharisees were a religious leadership class of the day, and at the core of their practice of faith was a focus on righteousness. They believed that the best way you could live out your faith was to follow the laws and the commandments as perfectly as possible, and the closer you got to perfect living, the closer you got to God. So while Jesus was teaching in the temple on that Tuesday, some Pharisees gathered with some Herodians. The Herodians were an outside political group that was affirming and supportive of the Roman government. And so you've got some faith leaders, and you've got some people who are very supportive of the Roman government, and they're going to ask a question to Jesus that's going to combine both of those 2 interests in a way that they hope is going to force him to choose to disappoint one or the other. So here's the question that they ask. Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? It really is a brilliant question, because if Jesus answers either way, he's going to disappoint someone. If he says no, it is not lawful for members of faith to pay the tax, then he's going to put himself at risk and in conflict with the Roman authorities. They could see him as treasonous. They could go ahead and arrest him, and that would end that week prematurely. He still had ministry to do, and he didn't want it to end there, so he has to be careful. If he answers no, we don't have to pay taxes, the Roman authority is going to respond harshly. Now, if he says, yes, we do have to pay taxes, then that's going to be a signal that's going to disappoint the faithful audience. You see, they believed that when the Messiah was going to come, and many people by this point were believing that Jesus was the Messiah and hoping he was the Messiah. They believed that when the Messiah came, the Messiah was going to separate the people of faith from the oppression of Roman leadership. And part of the sign of being free from that oppression would be that you no longer had to pay those taxes that were supporting the Roman government. And so if Jesus said, yeah, you've got to pay the taxes, that would please the Roman government, but it would be very disappointing to the people of faith, and they may reject and turn away from Jesus as the potential Messiah. Now, his answer is really quite crafty and very well put together. The first thing he does is just simply ask for a coin, a denarius, the coin that was used to pay taxes to the Roman Empire. This is an image of one of those coins, and it's got the image of Caesar on it. And this image of Caesar is very important. And on the coin are written these words, Tiberius Caesar, son of divine Augustus. So there's a godly claim here. So this is the coin that they have, and they give it to Jesus, and Jesus knows this is what the coin looks like. So he takes the coin, and as he holds the coin, he offers them this response. Whose head is this, and whose title? They answered, the emperor's. Then he said to them, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. Now, in this answer, Jesus provides he provides some really clear instruction, and that instruction is based on image. So what Jesus says here about this coin is that on the coin there is an image of the emperor, the image that represents the Roman authority. And Jesus says, well, since that's the image on this coin, and you're going to give that coin right back to the people that are represented by that image. You're just going to give them that coin back. Their image is on it. They can have it. Give to the emperor what is the emperor's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So now Jesus is no longer in trouble with the Herodians or at danger of being seen as treasonous to the Roman government. But now he's going to take it a step farther and talk about another image. And this is key. Jesus says to the people there, give to God what is God's. Now remember, in context here, Jesus is talking about things that are made in the image of. So that coin is made in the image of the emperor. And what are we made? What is made in the image of God? When Jesus says, give to God what is God's, Jesus is pointing to something that reflects the creation of God, that reflects the image of God. Now, of course, we knew, and the audience then surely knew, of the stories of creation. That in the stories of creation, we are told that humankind, male and female, are made in the image of God. So if we are made in the image of God, then we are to give to God what is God's, what is made in the image of God, in the same way that you're giving that coin to the emperor, which is made in the image of the emperor. We are giving to God that which is made in the image of God, which is us. As a people of faith, we are called to offer ourselves completely and wholly to God, because we've been made in the image of God. Give back to God what is God's. And since we've been made in the image of God, that is us. This is why the Apostle Paul, when writing to the Romans, remember, Paul was a Pharisee, one of those who at that point was trying to trip up Jesus. Here is how Paul refers to that, and it falls exactly in line with this teaching. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable worship. Now, as the people heard Jesus' answer to this question, they were astonished and they were impressed. The Pharisees and the Herodians were distressed. They were concerned because Jesus had answered the question in a way that they never saw coming, and they knew that they had been outsmarted. All right, let's talk about a second example of people trying to entrap Jesus. And this one comes from a group of people called the Sadducees. Now the Sadducees were also seen as part of the religious leadership of the day. But the Sadducees were also, they were different in this way. They were more of an aristocratic group. Yes, they were representative religious leadership, but there were some lineage issues there. They were very, very wealthy. They saw themselves as above and separate than normal and regular folk. They didn't believe that God engaged in the world or with the people of God on a daily and direct basis. They didn't believe in some of the things that we might refer to as spiritual, like angels and demons. They didn't believe in the resurrection. Those were not things that they felt were essential to faith. Now, they were very engaged with the laws of faith, maybe not as much so as the Pharisees were, but they were very engaged with the laws of faith and encouraged people to live into them. But they were less spiritual. So they're going to come at Jesus, and they're going to ask a question to try to trip him up, both about law and about resurrection. Here's how they did so. Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same, so also the third, all the way down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her. Again, on the surface, it's a really crafty and well put together question, and they surely thought that they had Jesus tripped up. Let me give you a little bit of history about about the thing upon which this question is based. It was based on something called Levirate marriage. And Levirate marriage is really, there's no way to describe it from the modern perspective as just anything but awful. Here's the way Levirate marriage worked. If a man died before he and his wife had children, the wife was under religious obligation to marry his brother. And the understanding was that if the wife married her deceased husband's brother and conceived a child, that child was recognized under the law of faith. A child was recognized as actually the descendant of the man who died. Not of the man's brother, but of the man who died. And because that the child was considered to be a direct descendant of that man, the child was eligible for all the things that came along with that, with inheritance, with family rights, with all of that stuff. The family name would continue through that child. So this was really about property. It was about passing on name. It was about that family legacy. It was a practice that treated women as property, as women as the vehicle through which even a man could continue his engagement and impact on earth after he had died. It was the patriarchy at its worst, and it was there's just no other description for it. It was just awful. And so these Sadducees have come to Jesus, and what they've played out is this story in its worst case scenario, that the wife of the first brother who died has to go through this 7 times in order to try to get a direct descendant for her original husband. It's just unthinkable. So Jesus is going to respond, I think, both to that, but also to say something about this idea of resurrection. Here's his response. You are wrong because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God, for in resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is the God not of the dead, but of the living. All right, let's unpack that just a little bit. In the opening lines, Jesus is challenging their read of Scripture. Yes, Levirate law is in Scripture, but Jesus is challenging their understanding of that, and Jesus is breaking it apart. and saying you are misunderstanding that, you are misreading that. And I think in doing so, Jesus is challenging the practice of that law. And certainly as we look at it in a modern context, we can look at that ethic and that law and say, no, that was not reflective of God's hope and God's will for humankind, for either male and particularly not for females who were caught up in that system. So Jesus challenges that law immediately. But then Jesus is going to move on to this idea of resurrection. And the first thing that Jesus says to the people who are there is, look, life in heaven is not like life here. In heaven, you're not married to other people. It doesn't work like that. You don't belong to other people. There is no marriage in heaven the way it is on earth. So Levirate marriage is dead and gone, but so is regular marriage. It just doesn't happen. You don't find yourself married in heaven. Now, some of you may hear that word as a relief, thinking, well, that might be a better approach to life, but some of you may find that a little bit discouraging. Because what does it say about heaven? Let me just say this about it. Jesus is pretty clear here that life in heaven is different than life on earth. We don't have the same kind of relationships there that we have here because we don't have the same kinds of needs there that we do here. We don't belong to people in the same way because in heaven, first and foremost, we belong to God. Now, having said that, there's nothing in this story that negates the hope and the promise that in heaven we find ourselves reconciled not only to God but also to our loved ones. There's nothing here that prohibits the idea that we will recognize others and be recognized by others. That's really not what this passage is about. The passage is simply saying, look, in heaven things are different. And then Jesus is going to move forward, going to push this a little bit further in the conversation of heaven and talk about this idea that they're saying, which they don't believe the resurrection is real. And so Jesus is going to talk about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And the way that Jesus is going to talk about them is saying, look, God is the God of the living, not the dead. And Jesus in that same passage says, I am their God. I am their God, and I am the God of the living, not the dead, which indicates pretty clearly that they are still living. They are part of the resurrection. As much as anything, this is a story where Jesus is reaffirming the reality of heaven and the promise of resurrection that's going to come through his death. Once again, brilliant answer, leaves the Sadducees shaken, and leaves the people drawn more closely into Jesus' message and his ministry. Now, at this point, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they're feeling discouraged, and so they come together because they've just got to figure out a way to trap Jesus. And so what they do is they come up with a question, and they get a lawyer to ask the question. It's pretty brilliant. And so the lawyer comes to Jesus and says to Jesus, which of all the commandments is the greatest commandment? Now again, as the others were, this question is meant to entrap Jesus. It's a trick question because according to the laws of faith, all commandments had to be followed equally. There wasn't some kind of hierarchy in the commandments. And what they're hoping to do is they're hoping to get Jesus to mention one and leave some others out. And if he does that, he's walked right into their trap. He answers with some words that we here at First Christian Church talk about a lot because they are central to our faith. Jesus said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now, this is just a brilliant response on so many levels. First of all, it's important for us to remember that the first part of Jesus' answer, that first part of the commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that's part of something called the Shema. This is one of the most important things to the Jewish faith. Every single Jewish person who heard these words recognized recognized the origin of these words. And so when Jesus says that this is the first and most important commandment, they recognize that he is speaking about the core of their faith, and they are on board. You cannot argue. There is no argument to be made that that is not the most important commandment. Then Jesus is going to take that commandment and move it one more step by saying there's a second commandment, which is like the first one. You're going to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, while it sounds like it's separated from the first, there is a connection, and it goes back to this idea of being created in the image of God. It goes back to that idea of giving to the emperor what was made in the emperor's image, and then giving to God what was made in God's image, and humans are made in God's image. And so we remember that. We know we're called to give ourselves to God because we're made in God's image. But in this teaching, Jesus reminds us that our neighbor is also made in God's image. And they are made in God's image in the same way that we are made in God's image. And in God's eyes, we are equal. And so we are called to treat our neighbor as ourselves, at least in part because our neighbor is a reflection of God and made in God's image. And how we treat our neighbor is a direct reflection of how we are offering first ourselves to God, and second, how we would treat God if we were to encounter God. Now, this teaching, these two teachings, are at the center of our faith. They're the central part of our faith. Everything that we do as a people of faith are built around this. All the laws and the prophets, Jesus says, rely on that. They hang on that. That was true then, and it's true now. Jesus is not negating other religious laws in Scripture, neither ancient nor modern. That is not what Jesus is doing. But what Jesus is saying is that every single law has to hang on those two things. And those two things supersede every other law. If those laws aren't carried out with these two things in mind, then those laws are being carried out inaccurately and unfaithfully. Now, we've talked about this numerous times, but it's worth a quick mention. While those things are at the center of our faith, there is room for people to get at those things and live into those things differently. We do not have to live into those commandments in ways that look exactly like one another. And that's the beauty of the diversity of our faith. I think at this moment, Jesus is even making room for Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians and Jewish people and non-Jewish people, those Gentiles. Jesus is making room here for everyone to be a part of his ministry and his mission on earth. To love God and to love neighbor. Now, at the end of the day on Tuesday, Jesus leaves the temple, and as he does so, he turns to his disciples and he points back to the temple and he says, truly I tell you, this temple will be destroyed. Not a single stone will be left standing. Now, this was an astonishing thing to say because the temple was just such a massive and huge structure. And interestingly enough, Jesus' words are going to come true in a literal fashion. Within just a few short years, about 30, 35 years, the temple is going to be destroyed. And the walls are going to come tumbling down in a very literal and real fashion, something no one saw coming. But I don't think Jesus is just talking about a building here. I think Jesus is talking about something more important. In fact, Jesus says that in 3 days, he's going to destroy that temple and rebuild it. And in those words, Jesus is clearly talking about his death, his burial, and his resurrection. Events that will ultimately change everything. But the core of those events are stories for another day, and we're going to get to those. But as we move closer toward those, let us remember this. Let us remember these things from the lessons Jesus gave us on Tuesday. First, friends, we are called to give ourselves to God wholly and completely. We have been made in God's image, and as such, we are called to offer ourselves as living sacrifices to the one who offers his self as a sacrifice for us. Second, let us remember that the resurrection is real. The resurrection that Jesus promises and brings to reality through his death and resurrection is real for us. And Jesus wants us to understand that and believe that just as his tomb is going to be empty, our tomb is going to be empty. And that is good news for the people of God. Finally, as a people of God, we are called to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. These last words really speak to me at this particular time of uncertainty in our churches, in our communities, and in our lives. The world needs the church. The world needs people who believe in and love Jesus with all their heart and follow Jesus passionately, so much so that we love our neighbor as ourselves, not putting ourselves above our neighbor, but recognizing that even if it comes with sacrifice, we are called to treat our neighbor as we would treat ourselves. Because in so doing, that's how we are treating God, and that's how we are seeing God. And in this moment, when we're a little bit uncertain and maybe a little bit afraid and maybe a little bit worried, and when we're out buying all the toilet paper that we can buy, and we're trying to grab all the sanitizer, and we're trying to figure out how much we should stay home and how much we should go out, and we're trying to figure out all this stuff about how I should handle this. Jesus is saying to us very clearly, it isn't just about you. It's also about your neighbor. Because I'm in your neighbor as much as I am in you, and your neighbor is created in my image just as much as you are created in your image. Love your neighbor as you love yourselves. Friends, I think in the midst of what we're experiencing right now, words like that are the kinds of words that will help us find our way through a challenging and an upsetting moment. And not only find ourselves and find our ways through it, but come out the other side even stronger. And I don't know about you, but with all that's going on, those are words that I need to remember. And when I remember them, I find myself comforted, because I know just as I would reach out and care for you, you would do the same thing for me. May it be so. Amen.